Tonight, we're starting with a ruler who made a choice that would give any royal advisor a small, quiet heart attack. Not a war declaration, not a scandal, not even a suspicious accident involving a goblet and a conveniently placed cousin. No, she did something far more unsettling. She ordered her own name erased. Not after she died, not after she lost, not because an enemy conquered her city and decided to do a little light vandalism on the royal monuments. While she still sat on the throne, she began removing the one thing a monarch is supposedly obsessed with preserving: her name. And I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone do that? What kind of queen looks at history and says, actually, let's leave that part blank? Well, that's what we're slowly, gently, and painfully calmly unraveling tonight. But before we slip into it, if you enjoy these quiet, story-shaped documentaries, you can leave a like and subscribe. Only if you genuinely want more of this kind of slow, strange history. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is for you right now. Are you listening from a place that's wide awake or from the edge of sleep? Now, get a little more comfortable, lower the lights until the room feels softer. If you have a fan nearby or any gentle background noise you like, let it run. Let it cover the sharp corners of the day. Because the world we're entering is old and dusty and full of people who believe that a name was not just a label, but a kind of spell. And when a person with power decides to destroy her own spell, you have to wonder, was she afraid? Was she guilty? Was she brilliant? Or was she simply trying to survive something worse than death? In our world, you can disappear with a password change and a privacy setting. Back then, disappearance took work: stone, ink, seals, witnesses, silence. And somehow she managed it. At least she tried. So let's begin the way every mystery like this begins. Not with her face, not with a portrait, not with a dramatic speech, with an object. A royal stone, pulled from the mud near a riverbank, carved with titles, honors, symbols of authority, all proudly intact. And in the place where the name should be, there's only smooth damage, not time, not weather, careful hands. As if someone leaned in close and decided that the most dangerous thing on that monument was a single word. The stone sits there like it's trying to pretend it's ordinary. A rectangle of river-dark rock, the kind that looks unimpressive until someone wipes the silt away and the carved lines catch the light softly like tired silver. The titles are still there. The honors. The little decorative flourishes that say, very politely, this person owned you. But the name is gone. Not cracked away by a falling roof beam, not chewed by weather, not softened by centuries of rain. This is different. This is the kind of blank you get when someone takes their time. When someone stands close enough to smell the stone dust and chooses to remove only what matters. And you can tell it mattered because of what they didn't remove. They left the crown symbol. They left the river glyph. They left the ceremonial epithets. Those long, self-congratulatory lines that rulers always give themselves because apparently one job wasn't enough. They left everything except the single word that would have turned this from a queen existed into this queen existed. So the first question, of course, is who would do that? And the second question is worse. Why would a queen allow it? Because here's the thing about power, real power, the kind that taxes you and drafts you and tells you what you're allowed to sell in the marketplace. Real power usually wants to be remembered. It wants songs. It wants statues. It wants a future where people point at a wall and say, ah yes, the glorious reign of whoever. This stone refuses to give you that. It's like a book with the title page torn out, like a portrait with the face rubbed away, like a crown sitting on a cushion with no one left to complain about how heavy it is. And that blank space, that missing name, becomes louder than the rest of the carving. So let's talk about where this stone came from. Because it didn't come from a palace museum, or a temple display, or a proud family archive with a bored descendant guarding it. It came from mud, from a bend in a wide river where the water slows down, drops its silt, and quietly buries whatever falls in. The locals in the region used to call that part of the bank the swallowing place, which is a charming name if you don't think about it too hard. Fishermen would occasionally pull up old tiles, broken pottery, the rusted ribs of anchors, and once in a while rare, and usually followed by a lot of shouting, they'd find a stone that wasn't supposed to be there, a cut stone, a work stone, the kind of stone you only bother shaping when you have spare labor, spare time, and a government that believes it will live forever. Which brings us to Ilyrra. That was the name of the kingdom that grew fat and stubborn along this river delta, an old, humid place built on trade and paperwork. And if you're picturing shining marble and endless banners, let's gently lower those expectations. Ilyrra was not an empire of perfect beauty. It was an empire of damp warehouses, of salt sheds, of tax offices, of granaries and docks and scribes who could ruin your life with a reed pen. It was the sort of kingdom where the true ruler wasn't always the person in the crown. Sometimes it was the person who controlled the scales in the salt market. Sometimes it was the priest who decided which names were clean enough to be spoken in the temple. And sometimes it was a clerk in a back room who decided your village had miscounted its grain deliveries. Whoops! Now, the river that fed Ilyrra was wide and slow, the kind of river that makes people think they understand nature. It flooded politely most years and violently in the years it didn't. It carried reeds, fish, boats, and the occasional body when politics got energetic. Along the river were small towns that smelled like wet rope and drying nets, and larger cities where the air tasted of brine from the salt pans. Salt, in Ilyrra, wasn't just seasoning. It was money you could eat. It was preservation. It was trade. It was the difference between surviving winter and staring thoughtfully at an empty bowl. Which means the salt trade was the artery of the kingdom, and whoever controlled it could squeeze gently and watch entire districts panic. This is important because in a kingdom like this, a name wasn't only pride. A name was a tool, a lever, a weapon. And Ilyrra had a particular obsession with names. Some cultures worship stars or mountains or storms. Ilyrra worshipped documentation. They believed a thing wasn't fully real until it was written down. A marriage, a debt, a boundary line, a treaty, a birth. Even death in the more organized districts came with a record. Imagine being so bureaucratic that you need paperwork to stop existing. And in the middle of all this ink and clay and counting, the royal name sat at the top like a keystone. The monarch's name went on laws, on tax ledgers, on trade seals pressed into wax and clay, on the temple's nightly recitations, where priests would speak the ruler's name aloud as if it strengthened the walls themselves. So when you remove that name, you don't just remove vanity, you rip out the thread that ties the whole public story together, which makes the blank space on that stone feel illegal. And that's why scholars who study Ilyrra, yes, even now, even in our calm little bedtime documentary, keep returning to that single carved void like a tongue worrying a missing tooth. Was this the work of an enemy? Was it a rebellion? Was it a rival dynasty taking a victory lap? Or was it something far stranger? Was it official? Because the blank is too neat, too deliberate. It's not someone smashing a statue in anger. It's someone doing their job carefully, someone with permission, someone with the time to do it correctly. And if you zoom out from the stone itself, the setting only makes it weirder. This wasn't found in a ruin that had been violently destroyed. No charred beams, no collapsed walls packed with arrowheads, no dramatic final day layer. It was found where things drift when they're thrown away quietly. And people don't throw away royal monuments unless they have a reason or an order. Now, if you were living in Ilyrra during the height of its power, your day would have been filled with sound. Markets in the morning, shouting sellers, clinking weights, splashing buckets, and the constant argument between "this is fair" and "I will starve." The docks, creaking wood, slap of water, sailors singing badly, and officials asking questions you can't afford to answer wrong. Temples, bells, murmured prayers, the scraping of sandals, and the soft, rhythmic chant of names. Always names. Names of gods, names of kings, names of donors who paid for a new roof beam and demanded eternity in exchange. And in the middle of the city, above the noise, the palace would loom, not necessarily grand, but undeniably present. Guard towers, courtyards, storerooms, a lot of storerooms, because most governments are just organized hoarding. And inside those walls, there would be rooms you'd never see unless you were important or unlucky. Records rooms, seal rooms. The scribal hall, where young apprentices learned to write symbols that could move grain from one district to another or move soldiers from one border to the next. And in a kingdom built on records, the queen's name was not a poetic flourish. It was a key. Without it, edicts were just suggestions. Taxes were just theft with extra steps. Treaties were just nice letters that no one had to obey. So again, why erase it? Let's take a slow look at what exactly is missing from the stone, because the shape of the absence tells you what was there. The name wasn't simply chiseled out in a rough rectangle. It was carved out following the original outline, as if someone traced the old letters and removed them stroke by stroke, which means whoever did it could see the name clearly when they started. They weren't guessing, they weren't correcting, they were unmaking. In some places, you can still see tiny grooves, like the ghost of a curve that used to be part of a letter, a partial line, a faint hook, enough to make you think, if I stare long enough, will I figure it out? And the answer is no. That's the cruelty of it. You can almost read it, and yet you can't. It's the historical equivalent of someone standing in front of you and saying, I'm not going to tell you, then smiling politely. Now, Ilyrra had a tradition of royal inscriptions that followed a standard pattern. First came the titles, because in case you forgot who was in charge, they were happy to remind you. Guardian of the river mouth, keeper of the salt gates, favored of the 9 lamps, things like that. Then came a ceremonial line about stability and divine favor. Then came the name, usually set inside a decorative border, an oval or a cartouche-like frame meant to protect it, emphasize it, and make it easy to recognize across a crowded temple wall. That border is still there on this stone. The frame remains perfectly intact, like a picture frame around nothing. So the message isn't, the queen was unimportant. It's the opposite. The message is, the name was too important to leave. And if you're thinking this sounds like the work of a conquering rival, that's a reasonable first guess. Because name erasure did happen in many places, in many times, for many ugly reasons. But those erasures usually come with replacement. A new name stamped in, a new title hammered over the old, a fresh layer of propaganda. Forget them, remember me. Illyra's blank doesn't offer you a replacement. It doesn't celebrate the destroyer, it just removes. And that kind of erasure is colder, more controlled, more intimate. It feels less like conquest and more like surgery. And as we keep looking at this stone, we find something even stranger. There are markings that indicate it was once displayed somewhere official, likely a temple courtyard or a public hall near the palace. The back edge has wear patterns from being set into a base. The sides show old transport scratches from being moved deliberately, not dragged in a panic. So at some point, someone took a royal monument, removed the name carefully, and then relocated it, possibly dumped it in the river. Which is an act that carries weight in Illyra's culture, because rivers weren't just water, they were memory, they were boundary. They were the thing that gave life and also swallowed the evidence. And in a humid kingdom where paper molds and ink runs, stone was supposed to be the permanent medium. Stone was the promise. So if you throw a stone into the river, you're not just discarding an object, you're trying to make permanence drown. And that brings us back to the idea we opened with. The queen didn't lose her name, she made it disappear. But how? Because a monarch's name doesn't live in one place, it lives everywhere. On seals that close letters and validate shipments. On temple lists the priests chant in order. On the corners of coins. On the lips of officials who begin every public announcement with the same rehearsed phrase. So to erase it, you'd need more than a chisel. You'd need a plan. You'd need cooperation. You'd need either absolute authority or a terrifying amount of leverage. Think about it. You'd have to tell scribes to stop writing it, tell priests to stop speaking it, tell stoneworkers to remove it from public inscriptions, tell officials to pretend they never knew it. And you'd have to do it without triggering the exact thing you're trying to avoid: panic, rebellion, or a sudden spike in palace accidents. Which suggests the queen understood something her enemies didn't. That names in Ilyrra were not just identifiers, they were handles. If you can grab the name, you can pull the person. You can attach rumors to it, crimes, failures, blasphemies. You can make the name carry a burden so heavy it collapses the throne. And Ilyrra, being the kind of kingdom it was, excelled at rumor. The city's gossip moved faster than its official messengers. A single phrase whispered at the salt market could reach the palace kitchens by dusk. And once the kitchens heard it, it was basically law. So perhaps the queen was trying to do the only thing that could not be argued with. Not defend her name, not purify it, not outshine the rumors with triumphs, but remove the target entirely, which again sounds insane, unless you know what happened in the years before the blank, unless you know what kind of pressure was building under the polished floors of the palace. And we will get there, slowly, But first, we need one more piece of evidence, something smaller than a monument, but in many ways more powerful. Because stones are public, they're meant to be seen, seals are private. They touch the kingdom where it actually lives, in letters, shipments, orders, and quiet commands sent at night. In Ilyrra, a royal seal was not decorative. It was the difference between, please do this, and do this or face consequences that have paperwork. Seals were pressed into wax or clay, marked with symbols that only official hands were allowed to use. The palace guarded them carefully, not because they were beautiful, but because they were dangerous. If you controlled the seal, you could speak with the monarch's voice on paper. You could move money. You could move soldiers. You could, in a very real sense, move reality. And that's why the next artifact matters so much. It wasn't found in mud. It was found in a jar in a collapsed storeroom wrapped in cloth, hidden among broken lamps and cracked measuring weights. A small disc of metal, tarnished by time, with a handle worn smooth by fingers. A seal. At first glance, it looks ordinary for Ilyrra border pattern, inner emblem, the usual geometry meant to deter counterfeiters. But then you notice what's missing, the name, again. Where the queen's name should be engraved in reverse so it reads correctly when pressed, there's only a title, not a family name, not a throne name, not even a shortened form meant for bureaucracy, just a phrase, a deliberate, almost chilling phrase. She, who, remains. And if that doesn't make your mind sit up a little, consider the implication. This was not an enemy defacing her seal. This was the seal that was used, the official tool of state, the thing that made orders real, and it carried no name, only identity by absence, which means this wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a folk story that grew dramatic over centuries. It was policy. It was administrative. It was stamped into the daily life of the kingdom, grain transfers, dock permissions, temple allocations, border patrol schedules. Imagine receiving an official decree sealed by someone who refuses to be named. It's like being commanded by a shadow that still expects you to pay taxes. And the seal wasn't alone. With it was a fragment of a wax impression taken from an early decree, one of the first documents scholars can place at the beginning of the Nameless period. The wax is dark, almost black, the kind made with resin and soot. The impression is clear, the emblem, the border, the title, and above it, in careful script, steady, practiced handwriting, not rushed in panic, there's a line that changes everything. Not poetic, not ceremonial, not gentle, just an instruction. Protect the throne and erase the name. And with that, the blank space on the stone stops being a curiosity. It becomes a doorway, because no one issues a command like that unless something is already coming. And whatever was coming was bad enough that a queen decided anonymity was safer than immortality. So now we have two things, a monument with a name removed, and a seal that never had the name in the first place. And the question shifts slightly. It's no longer who erased her. It's what was she running from that made her erase herself? And to answer that, we're going to have to go back before the missing name became law. Back to a young woman in a palace full of noise. Back to a kingdom where ink was power. Back to the beginning, before anyone thought a queen could rule without the one thing everyone insisted she needed, a name. So we go back. Back before the blank stones, before the nameless seal, before anyone in Ilyrra had to learn the uncomfortable skill of obeying an authority they couldn't properly refer to. Back to a girl who still had a name, people were willing to say out loud, Seren. And if that name sounds small against the heavy machinery of a river kingdom, good. It was supposed to. Seren came from the kind of family history forgets on purpose. Not because they were tragic or cursed or secretly important, but because they were ordinary in the most inconvenient way. They were useful, local, and replaceable. Her father managed a stretch of reed land on a tributary east of the Delta Flat ground, where the soil could grow barley if the floods were polite, and where the mosquitoes behaved like tiny, unpaid tax collectors. They weren't starving peasants. They weren't glittering nobility. They were the middle layer, the sort of house that fed the kingdom and was thanked mostly by being left alone. Mostly. In Ilyrra, being left alone was never a permanent condition. The river made sure of that. One year the water rose early and drowned seedlings. Another year it held back and left mud that cracked like old pottery. Taxes didn't care. The temple chants didn't care. The palace, with its storerooms and seals and ledgers, certainly didn't care. And then, as if nature wasn't enough, there was politics. Because the Delta cities fought in a quieter way than most kingdoms did. They fought with contracts, with tariffs, with the placement of a dock, with a single line in a ledger that changed a tax rate by a fraction and somehow ruined 3 villages by spring. Seren was around 14 when her family became valuable to the palace in the most flattering way possible. They were chosen. Not chosen for honor exactly, chosen as insurance. The palace was mediating a dispute between 2 salt houses, one that controlled the southern pans and one that controlled the barges that carried the salt north. The argument had become expensive, not bloody necessarily, just tense. And when Ilyrra got tense, it sent for paperwork and hostages. Hostage is such an ugly word though. The palace preferred something softer. Guest, ward, companion. A young noble brought to court for her education, to learn refinement, to become acquainted with the heart of the kingdom. In practice, it meant this. If her father's faction misbehaved, the palace would remember Seren existed. So Seren was dressed in her best linen, bleached almost white, belt stitched with little shells her aunt swore were lucky, and placed on a riverboat that smelled like wet wood and old fish. She watched the shoreline drift past in slow motion, and she did what anyone sensible would do in a situation like this. She listened. Because the adults around her were nervous, and nervous adults talk. They talked about the court as if it were a living animal. They talked about which gate you entered by, and what that said about your status. They talked about the scribal hall, a place Seren had never seen, but which sounded like a room where people decided reality. They talked about names, always names. Which families were rising, which were fading, which priest had begun emphasizing which god in the temple chants, which, in Ilyrra, was essentially a political editorial. And they talked about the king, Orun. They said his name as if it were already a title. Orun, who had taken the throne young and had not yet been crushed by it. Orun, who smiled in public and made people believe, briefly, that the kingdom was run by something other than fear and accounting. They also said one other thing, usually in a quieter voice. Orun's court was loud, not loud like a battlefield. Loud like a house full of relatives who all want something at the same time. And you don't survive a loud court by being louder. You survive by becoming useful. The city itself came into view like a long thought. Low buildings clustered around the river's bend, then taller ones, then the steady geometry of walls and docks and warehouses. And above it all, the palace complex, less a single glittering castle, and more a dense knot of courtyards, storage rooms, guard towers, and administrative halls. It wasn't designed to impress you, it was designed to function, which, in its own way, was more intimidating. Seren entered through a gate that smelled like iron and sun-warmed stone. The guards didn't leer or laugh. They didn't have to. They looked right through her, the way people look through a crate being delivered. A steward with careful hands took her name, her family line, her river tributary, and her age, and wrote it down. That was her first lesson. Before anyone offered her water, before anyone asked her how her journey had been, before anyone told her where she would sleep, they recorded her. Because in Ilyrra, you didn't really arrive until you were entered into a list. Seren was given a small suite near an inner courtyard, a place with a fountain that ran only when the water engineers felt generous. She was assigned attendants who were polite in the same way a locked door is polite. She was instructed on etiquette, where to stand, how to lower her eyes without seeming insolent, which corridor was for which class of person, and what not to ask. If you want to understand the palace, imagine a living organism made of rules. Rules about food, rules about clothing, rules about who is allowed to touch which seal. Rules about who is allowed to speak first in a room. Rules about who is allowed to say the king's name without adding an epithet afterward. Yes, really. If you said Orun too plainly in the wrong place, someone would cough and someone else would look offended, and a third person would write your name down somewhere out of habit. And in a way, it was all calming, for about a day. Then you realized the rules weren't there to keep order. They were there to keep people in their place. Seren adapted quickly, mostly because she had no choice. At first, she was used as a decorative piece at formal meals, sat at a distance that signaled her family's importance without allowing her any actual influence. She learned the first survival skill of court life, how to smile while your feet hurt, The second skill came soon after, how to listen without reacting, because the conversations around her were always doing two things at once. On the surface, they were discussing harvest yields, dock repairs, temple festivals. Underneath, they were testing each other. Who was allied to whom? Who was lying? Who had heard the latest rumor? And who could afford to believe it? Seren noticed in those early weeks that the most powerful people in the palace were not always the loudest. The loud ones were easy to predict. They wanted recognition. But the quiet ones wanted results. There was a woman who ran the household staff, for example, Lady Miru, a lean figure with calm eyes and hands that always smelled faintly of soap and herbs. Lady Miru could make a noble's favorite dish appear or vanish for an entire season. She could decide whether a message got lost between kitchens and chambers. She could decide whether you were dressed in time for a ceremony or whether you arrived looking unprepared and therefore weak. People bowed to the king. But when Lady Miru raised an eyebrow, people hurried. Then there was the captain of the inner gate, Captain Dast, whose face looked carved from old wood and who spoke in short sentences the way someone speaks when they've learned that every extra word is a risk. He wasn't cruel, he was efficient. And efficiency in a palace is frightening. But the most interesting person Seren noticed was someone most nobles barely saw, the chief scribe, Master Keshen. He walked like he was trying not to disturb the air. He smelled faintly of ink and lamp oil. His fingers were stained, permanently, as if the written world had seeped into his skin. And when he looked at people, he didn't look at their jewelry. He looked at their mouths, as if he was watching what names they chose to say. Seren met him properly because she made a mistake, a small one. During a minor ceremony, she stepped half a pace forward when she should have stepped back. Nothing dramatic. No one drew a sword, no one shouted. But Master Keshen noticed. Later that evening, a note arrived in her room, not a threat, not an invitation, an instruction, 3 lines written in a clean hand. Attend the scribal hall at second lamp. Bring no jewelry. Bring patience. No signature. Of course. Seren considered pretending she hadn't received it. Then she remembered she was a guest, so she went. The scribal hall was cooler than the rest of the palace, with thick walls that kept the heat out and the noise down. Rows of low desks, jars of reed pens, blocks of wax, clay tablets stacked like bricks, shelves of rolled parchment tied with cord, and scribes, young and old, working with a kind of calm urgency, their pens scratching like insects. This was the part of the palace that didn't shine. It hummed. Master Keshen didn't scold her. He didn't praise her either. He simply looked at her and said very softly, "You're here because you can be useful." Seren waited for the insult hidden inside that statement. It didn't come. Instead, he gave her a tablet and told her to copy a list. Names, not poetic names, not divine names. Names of barges and dock masters and grain inspectors. She copied them until her wrist ached. Then he corrected her. Not the spelling, the spacing. Because in Ilyrra, the way a name sat on a page mattered. A name too large was arrogance. A name too small was disrespect. A name too close to another name suggested association, which could be interpreted as alliance, which could be interpreted as conspiracy. Seren stared at the page and realized her third lesson of court life. The palace didn't just govern bodies, it governed meaning. Over the following months, Seren's education expanded. She learned how royal decrees were structured, the opening that invoked stability, the middle that carried the actual command, the closing that threatened consequences in polite language. She learned that the temple's lists of honored names were updated like political weather reports. She learned that trade agreements were written in duplicate and stored in separate places because Ilyrra trusted ink but didn't trust people. And she learned something else, something darker, something that would stay with her. A scribe could destroy you without ever raising his voice. He could misspell your name in an official record and accidentally remove your inheritance. He could copy your family line incorrectly and prove you had no claim. He could lose a contract. He could find a debt. He could, with a single stroke, turn you into a rumor. If you've ever wondered why people fear paperwork, it's because paperwork is slow violence. And Seren, watching the scribes, realized the kingdom's true bloodstream wasn't the river. It was the archive. Now, Seren didn't become a scribe, not officially, not in the way the apprentices did, with their shaved heads and their years of copying, but she became something just as dangerous. a noble who understood what scribes understood, that the story of the kingdom was manufactured daily, and that names were the raw material. Outside the scribal hall, court life continued, loud, layered, and a little absurd. There were banquets where food arrived in such quantities you'd think the kingdom was trying to intimidate hunger itself. There were musicians who played the same songs repeatedly because tradition is just repetition with a better outfit. There were pets, small dogs with jeweled collars that were treated with more courtesy than some visiting diplomats. And there were constant little dramas, a noblewoman's bracelet disappearing, a servant accused of overhearing something, a priest complaining that the king's name had not been spoken with enough reverence at a festival. Yes, again, names. Seren began noticing how names were used like knives, not in open combat, in little, precise cuts. A rival would accidentally use an old epithet for someone, one associated with a past scandal. A singer in the market would perform a new rhyme that turned a respected official's name into a joke. A priest would linger too long on a syllable during a chant, subtly implying displeasure from the gods, and everyone would pretend it was nothing. Because the beauty of a name attack is that it leaves no bruise you can point to, only a feeling, only a shift in how people look at you. Seren experienced it personally when a courtier, smiling, perfectly polite, asked her, in front of others, whether her name was Seren or Saren, because he had heard it both ways. It was such a small thing, and yet the moment hung in the air like smoke. If she corrected him sharply, she looked rude. If she let it pass, she looked weak. If she laughed, she looked unserious. 3 options, all unpleasant. Seren smiled and said, gently, "It's whatever the record says." A small joke, a small deflection, but it landed. Because everyone in that room understood what she meant. The record decides. Master Keshen heard about it later and, according to one apprentice, allowed himself the faintest expression of approval. Not a smile, more like the relaxing of a single muscle. Then Oren noticed her. Not in the dramatic way stories like to pretend. There was no thunder, no slow-motion eye contact across a hall. He noticed her the way a ruler notices anything useful. Gradually. Oren was in his early 20s at the time, already king, already burdened, but still wearing youth-like armor. He moved through ceremonies smoothly. He spoke well. He had the careful charisma of someone who understood that in Ilyrra, you didn't only rule by force, you ruled by performance. When Oren entered a public space, people's voices changed. They didn't just get quieter. They rearranged themselves around him. And his name was everywhere, on banners, on coin stamps, in the temple chants, in the little greetings dock workers used when they wanted to seem loyal. Orun's name was a roof. People stood under it. So when he decided to marry, it wasn't framed as romance. It was framed as architecture, a support beam, a way to stabilize the Delta alliances and quiet the salt dispute that had brought Seren to court in the first place. Seren's family, being small and strategically placed, was safe, not too powerful to threaten him, not too insignificant to be insulting, and Seren, being quiet and sharp, was workable. The announcement was made during a temple festival, one of those endless days when everyone pretends not to be exhausted. Orun stood before the 9 lamps, the sacred flames that represented the kingdom's balanced order, and spoke Seren's name out loud. Officially, publicly, with the right reverence. That was, in Ilyrra, an act of creation. From that moment on, Seren wasn't just a guest, she was a piece of the throne. The marriage itself was a blur of ritual, the exchange of gifts, linen, salt bricks, carved reeds, the recitation of family lines, the sealing of documents with wax that smelled like pine resin. And Seren, sitting beside Oren, understood something that made her stomach tighten. Her name was now tied to his, which meant every rumor aimed at him could splash onto her, every mistake he made could stain her, and every enemy who couldn't reach his throat could reach her reputation instead. In the first year, things were almost calm. Oren listened to her more than most people expected. Not openly, not as an equal in council. This was still Ilyrra, and Ilyrra loved its hierarchies. But in quieter moments, in rooms where the air smelled of lamp oil and warm stone, he would ask her what she thought about a petition, or a trade complaint, or a priest's recent suggestions. Seren never pushed. She offered answers like someone sliding a document across a table. Neat, useful, hard to argue with. And slowly, She built a kind of invisible power, the power of being trusted not to be dramatic, which sounds like a small thing, until you remember how rare it is in a palace. But even in that calmer period, the name problem kept showing itself. A border governor failed to stop bandits, and within days the market sons were using the governor's name as a punchline. A noble house fell into debt, and their family name became shorthand for foolishness. A temple clerk was accused of stealing lamp oil, and the priest did not punish him publicly. He punished his name. He removed it from a donor list. In Ilyrra, being unnamed was a social death sentence. Seren watched this, quietly filing it away, because she was beginning to see the shape of the trap. If your name was honored, it could lift you. If your name was attacked, it could crush you. And the more famous your name became, the more weight it could carry. Oren's name carried the kingdom. Seren's name, now attached to his, was beginning to carry something else. Expectations, jealousies, fears. And as the seasons turned, the court's noise changed, not louder, sharper. There were disagreements in council about the salt tariffs. Always the salt, always the blood of the kingdom. There were whispers about the Northern League watching Ilyrra's docks a little too closely. There were murmurs that the temple was unhappy with Oren's spending on river defenses instead of shrine renovations. And there were the old, familiar rumors that bloom in any court like mold in a damp storeroom. That Seren was too involved, that she was writing Oren's decisions, that she had learned too much from the scribes, that she was not merely queen but something else, a hand behind the curtain. None of it was proven, none of it needed to be, because rumors don't need truth, they need repetition, and Seren again understood the mechanism. If someone could attach a story to her name, they could make the story stick, and if the story stuck long enough, it became political fact. Then came the festival, the one people later argued over, because every disaster needs a calendar date. It was the festival of full current, held when the river ran high and the barges moved fast. An annual celebration that mixed gratitude, superstition, and a convenient excuse for the palace to show itself. The streets were crowded, the temple lamps burned brighter. Musicians played until their fingers hurt. Oren appeared on the palace balcony and let the crowd chant his name like a tide. It was, in the simplest sense, good politics. Give people a name to love, and they will forgive you a lot. Seren stood beside him, composed, her expression calm enough to be interpreted however the viewer wanted, and below them, in the noise, she heard what she always heard: names, praises, insults, little rhymes, little barbs, the city-eating language and spitting it back out. After the public appearance, they returned inside for the formal meal, more ritual than dinner, more performance than nourishment. There were the usual dishes: river fish with herbs, flatbread, spiced lentils, sweet cakes made with dates. There were officials lined up to offer blessings and petitions and carefully rehearse gratitude. Oren smiled, nodded, accepted. And then, halfway through a sentence, some mild joke meant to make a visiting envoy feel welcome. Oren stopped. Just stopped. As if someone had cut the string holding him upright. His hand tightened on the edge of the table. His face lost color in a slow, alarming way. For one heartbeat, the hall went silent. And in that silence, you could hear how many people were breathing. Oren tried to speak again. He didn't finish the word. He swayed, caught himself, then sat hard, like a man suddenly remembering gravity. Seren leaned toward him, her voice low. "What's that?" she asked, as if naming the moment could control it. Oren blinked, too slowly. His eyes didn't focus. A physician was summoned, of course, because nothing says we are calm, like running for a doctor while everyone pretends not to panic. Servants moved with that special palace efficiency, the kind that looks smooth until you realize it's powered by terror. The meal ended early. Smiles were forced. Guests were dismissed with practiced politeness. And Oren was taken to his chambers behind 2 layers of guards as if illness were a criminal. By nightfall, the palace had changed, not outwardly. The torches still burned, the corridors still echoed. The fountains still trickled where they were allowed to. But the air had shifted, because a healthy king is a center of gravity. A sick king is a question mark. And in Ilyrra, question marks were dangerous things. Seren sat near Oren's bed while physicians argued in whispers. They spoke of heat in the blood, of imbalance, of exhaustion, of bad river air. They recommended rest, herbs, quiet, which is adorable advice for a king whose throne is built on motion. Oren's hand was warm and damp, his breathing shallow. He opened his eyes once and tried to say her name. He didn't manage it. That, more than anything, frightened her, because if a king cannot speak, others will speak for him, and the first thing they will speak for him is his name. Seren rose quietly and left the room, not dramatically, no sweeping robes, no confrontation in the hallway. Just a queen stepping into a corridor and becoming, for the first time, completely alone with the machinery of state. She walked toward the scribal hall. Late hours now, fewer lamps, less noise, and yet there was still someone awake there, because records do not sleep. Master Keshen looked up as she entered, as if he had been expecting the moment for years. Seren didn't waste words. She didn't declare herself. She didn't threaten. She simply said, "We need orders issued before morning." Keshen's eyes flicked briefly toward the door, toward the world outside, where names were already moving like wolves. "Under whose authority?" he asked. It was a simple question, and it held the entire kingdom inside it. Seren's throat tightened, because if she said Alrun's name, she tied the orders to a man who might not be able to confirm them. If she said her own name, she put herself directly in the path of every blade disguised as gossip. If she said the child heir's name, if she invoked a name that belonged to a boy too young to understand what a seal meant, she would be committing a different kind of cruelty. So Seren did something small, something that would not look dramatic on a monument, something that would not become a heroic painting. She took a blank strip of parchment and she wrote the necessary commands in steady handwriting. Border patrol rotations, grain release schedules, a quiet instruction to Captain Das to double the inner gate watch, but to do it without alarming the court. No flourishes, no grand titles, no reassuring speeches, just control reduced to ink. And when she reached the end, where the signature should go, where the royal name should anchor the entire thing, she paused. The room was very quiet. Even the scribes seemed to sense the weight of that blank space. Keshen didn't speak. He simply waited. Seren set down the pen, and she left the line empty. Then she reached for the seal. Not the public seal, not the one used for ceremonies. A smaller one, a practical one. A tool meant for nights when the palace needed to act quickly and quietly. She pressed it into the wax with a slow, deliberate motion. And when she lifted it, there was no name. Only the mark of authority, without the vulnerability of a word. Keshen stared at it for a long moment. Then, very softly, he said, "This will be noticed." Seren's voice, when she answered, was calm. "Let it," she said. Because outside those walls, in the sleeping city, the river kept moving. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the court, people were already choosing what story to attach to her name. Seren looked down at the unsigned order, the nameless seal impression cooling in the wax, and she understood with sudden clarity that tonight was not merely a medical crisis, it was a beginning. The king was ill. The kingdom was watching. And for the first time, Seren had issued commands that belonged to no one anyone could easily blame. In the morning, Arun would either recover or he wouldn't. And if he didn't, then the blank spaces would multiply. And the palace, loud, hungry, and obsessed with names, would come looking for one. The morning after Arun fell ill, the palace tried to behave as if nothing had happened, which is, of course, the palace's favorite hobby. The lamps were lit at the usual hours, the gates opened on schedule, the servants moved in their practice patterns, carrying trays and linens and news they pretended not to hear. The scribal hall kept scratching away at the day's records, because in Ilyrra, the kingdom didn't stop when the king did. And the city outside kept breathing, markets opening, boats unloading, priests washing their hands, children running barefoot through alleyways that smelled faintly of fish and warm mud. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't, because a healthy monarch is a certainty. A sick monarch is a question. And in Ilyrra, questions were expensive. At first, they called it a fever, then an imbalance, then exhaustion brought on by the weight of duty, which is a poetic way to say, we have no idea what's happening, but please keep paying taxes. Physicians came and went with pouches of herbs, bowls of bitter infusions, and expressions that tried to look wise while quietly panicking. Arun drifted in and out of awareness. Some days he could sit up, some days he couldn't. When he spoke, it was slow and slurred, like language itself had become heavy. And each time his voice failed him, the palace filled the silence with something else. Whispers, suggestions, plans. In the first week, Seren did what she had already begun doing the night of the festival. She kept the machinery moving. Orders went out to the docks. Grain release schedules were confirmed. The river engineers received their funding for levee repairs, because nothing says stable leadership like not drowning. Captain Dast quietly doubled the inner gate watch. Lady Miru tightened control of who entered which corridor and when, which is the palace equivalent of locking every door without admitting you're afraid. And Master Keshen kept stamping wax with seals that did not carry a name. That last detail felt small, almost invisible. But Ilyrra was a kingdom built from small details. Give it time, and small details became knives. The Council of Nobles met on the third day. Not because it was scheduled, because they couldn't help themselves. They gathered in a hall with painted reeds on the walls and a long table scarred by generations of impatient hands. They wore their finest robes and their most reasonable faces, which in Ilyrra usually meant, I am deeply concerned about the kingdom's future, and I have already decided that future should include me. They began, as councils always do, with prayer, a short invocation, a polite nod toward the gods, a convenient way to imply divine endorsement for whatever came next. Then they asked the question everyone had been circling like a hungry dog. Who is ruling? Not who is helping the king, not who is managing affairs in his absence. Who is ruling? And here's the problem. In a kingdom obsessed with names, authority needed to be attached to one, a named regent, a named guardian, a named hand of the throne, preferably a man, preferably from the right bloodline, preferably with a family big enough to frighten rivals into obedience. Seren was none of those things. She was the queen, yes, but in Ilyrra, queen was a title that could mean many things and, inconveniently, guarantee very little. Some queens hosted festivals, some bore heirs. Some smiled next to kings and disappeared politely into history like decorative punctuation. A queen who governed was less comfortable. The council proposed what they called a temporary arrangement. Temporary in palace language meant permanent if you let it happen. They wanted a regency council led by Lord Hadrin, Orun's maternal uncle, an aging noble with a smooth voice and the kind of eyes that made you feel as if your thoughts had already been priced. He spoke about stability. He spoke about tradition. He spoke about the danger of uncertainty. He spoke, of course, about names. The people need to know who to trust, he said, which is a lovely sentence until you translate it into what it really means. The people need to know who to blame. Seren didn't attend that meeting in person, not at first. She listened from behind a reed screen in a side chamber that opened into the hall through narrow latticework, an architectural feature designed for modesty and used, more often, for surveillance. It was not an accident that the screen existed. Ilyrra loved curtains, not because they were romantic, because curtains let you be present without being vulnerable. Seren sat in the dimness behind the lattice while the council talked themselves into courage. Captain Das stood nearby, motionless, a silent reminder that the palace still had teeth. Master Keshen sat in the council hall with a tablet, recording every word with steady hands. Scribes were neutral in the same way a blade is neutral, useful, sharp, and pointed at whoever holds it. Seren listened, her face calm, her body still, her mind doing the quiet work of measuring each noble's ambition. Who spoke first? Who agreed too quickly? Who avoided looking at the temple representative? Who used Orun's name with extra reverence, like they were trying to wrap themselves in it? And when Lord Hadrin finally said, the queen should rest and allow the council to carry the burden, Seren heard what he didn't say. The queen should step aside while we decide how much of her power we can safely consume. Now, you might expect Seren to storm into the hall and declare her rights. But in Ilyrra, storms were for weather. Politics was done with quieter tools, so she waited. And then she did something that felt almost boring. She sent a document, a regency declaration, drafted by Master Keshen, written in the clean, unornamented language of administration. It stated that the throne continues through the heir, and that the queen shall oversee the necessary functions of state until the king is restored. It did not argue, it did not plead, it did not explain, it simply existed, stamped with the palace seal. And again, where a name should have been, there was only authority pressed into wax. The council read it. The council frowned. The council, in that moment, realized Seren wasn't asking their permission. And that was when the temple began to move. Because the temple in Ilyrra was not merely a place of worship. It was a stage where legitimacy was performed nightly. Every evening, Priests lit the 9 lamps and recited a list of names, gods, founders, kings. An unbroken chain meant to reassure the city that the world was still in order. When the king's health became uncertain, the high priest, Namaru, demanded an audience. High priest Namaru was a man with a soft voice and a hard spine. He wore plain robes, but the plainness was deliberate, like a threat made without shouting. He arrived in the palace with temple attendants carrying incense and scroll cases, because even spirituality needed paperwork in Ilyrra. He asked Seren one simple question: "What name shall we chant?" Not "How is the king?" Not "How may the temple help?" What name shall we chant? Because if the temple stopped speaking the royal name, the public would understand immediately that something was wrong. And if the temple chose a different name, the kingdom would follow the sound. Seren met Namaru in a small antechamber where the air smelled of burned resin and old stone. She answered carefully. "The king's name remains," she said, "until the king's name cannot remain." Namaru's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he had just heard a legal loophole disguised as piety. "And if the king cannot speak?" he asked. Seren held his gaze. "Then the throne speaks," she said. A priest could argue theology all night, but a priest couldn't argue with a guard at a gate. Namaru left with a polite bow that did not reach his eyes. And that night, in the temple, Orun's name was chanted, slower than usual, softer than usual, like a candle struggling in a draught. The city heard the difference, and the city began to speculate. Now, speculation in Ilyrra was not a hobby, it was an industry. Within days, the marketplaces had their own version of events. Some said Orun had been poisoned by northern agents. Some said the gods were displeased with his spending on levies instead of shrine renovations. Some said the king had angered the river itself, and the river was taking him back piece by piece. And some, inevitably, said the queen was involved. Because when people fear uncertainty, they look for a story with a villain. And Seren was convenient. She was foreign enough to be suspicious, quiet enough to be called secretive, educated enough to be called manipulative. And worst of all, she had been seen near the scribes, which, in Ilyrra, was basically the same as being seen near a loaded crossbow. The rumors started small. A servant heard that Seren wrote the king's decrees. A temple attendant heard that Seren had changed the donor lists. A dockmaster heard that Seren's family was benefiting from the salt tariffs. Then the rumors grew teeth. Someone began using her birth name in public, not as a simple identifier, but as a sneer. Seren of nowhere, Seren of the reed, mud, Seren the scribe, queen, names once again turned into handles. And every handle made it easier for the city to pull. Seren didn't answer the rumors publicly. She couldn't. Public denial is like throwing water on oil. It spreads the shine. Instead, she kept doing what rulers do when they are trying not to be toppled by noise. She managed the boring things. And this, strangely, was her strength. Because a kingdom can tolerate many scandals, it cannot tolerate an empty granary. So Seren's days filled with ledgers and petitions, grain counts, tax schedules, dock repairs, the distribution of salt bricks to inland towns that couldn't preserve fish without them, levee inspections, the funding of bridge maintenance, the quiet replacement of 2 border commanders who had begun acting like local kings. If you're looking for romance, you won't find it here. There was no sweeping music, just the steady thud of administration. And yet, every choice she made was political. Release too much grain, and the nobles accuse you of draining the stores. Release too little, and the city accuses you of starving them. Fund the temple repairs, and the engineers complain the levies will fail. Fund the levies, and the temple whispers that the gods are displeased. No win, no peace, and definitely no quiet. Seren learned to live in that tension. She held court twice a week, seated not on the throne, but in a side chamber with a view of the river, symbolic, subtle, and less likely to trigger a noble's sense of outrage. Petitioners would enter and bow, and then look slightly confused, as if they'd expected the king's name to be spoken first. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Master Keshen, always careful, began introducing Seren with titles rather than names. Her Majesty, Guardian of the River Mouth. Titles were safe. Titles were armor. Names were skin. And behind the formal routine, the true battle continued. Lord Hadrin's faction pressed for a proper regency. High Priest Namaru pressed for ritual clarity. The Northern League sent polite inquiries that were really reconnaissance, and the palace itself, servants, guards, scribes, began choosing sides in small ways. A message delivered late, a door left unlocked, a tray arriving from the kitchens with an unfamiliar garnish. Small things, always small things before they became large. The attempt on Seren's life came on a day that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. The sky was pale, the river moved slow and thick. A breeze carried the smell of salt and warm mud into the palace corridors. Seren was reviewing grain allocations with Master Keshen when a junior clerk arrived with a sealed petition. "Urgent," he said, from the outer district. The wax seal looked correct. The cord was tied properly. The handwriting on the outside was neat, which is exactly why Seren felt her attention sharpen, because danger in a bureaucratic kingdom rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived politely with proper formatting. "Who brought this?" she asked. The clerk swallowed. He gave a name Seren didn't recognize, someone from the messenger pool, supposedly. Seren took the petition anyway, but she didn't break the seal. Instead, she set it down and looked at Master Keshen. "What's that?" she asked softly. Keshen leaned in, eyes narrowing slightly. He did not touch the wax, he simply stared at it long enough to see something Seren wouldn't. A flaw, a tiny inconsistency in the temple stamp pattern, the kind counterfeiters missed if they were in a hurry. Keshen's voice was quiet. "This is wrong." Seren's pulse stayed steady, but her mind moved fast. "Why?" she asked. Keshen didn't answer immediately. He called for a lamp and angled the light. There, almost invisible, was a second mark in the wax, a pinprick indentation. Not part of the seal, a puncture. The kind you make when you inject something into folded paper and reseal it. Poison, sometimes, could be delivered through ink or powder. Not dramatic, no smell, no bitter taste. Just a touch, absorbed through skin, and then the body does the rest. Seren leaned back slowly, as if she were simply considering the petition's contents. Then she did what a careful ruler does. She made it look like nothing. "Thank you," she told the clerk calmly. "Leave it there." The clerk bowed and left, relief visible in the way his shoulders loosened. Which was interesting. Seren waited until his footsteps faded. Then she nodded at Captain Darst, who had been standing near the doorway like a piece of furniture. Darst moved without sound, no shouting, no commotion. By the time the palace reached its next meal bell, that clerk would be questioned in a room without windows, and everyone would pretend it had never happened. Seren stared at the petition. A neatly packaged death delivered with good penmanship. It would have been almost admirable if it weren't trying to kill her. And in that moment, something settled inside her, because until now, the conflict had been rumors and counsels and priestly pressure. Words. But now, someone had reached beyond words. Someone had decided that the easiest way to solve the problem of Seren's authority was to remove Seren. And once that line is crossed, it never uncrosses. From that day on, Seren's routines became tighter. Food was tasted by trusted staff. Messages were handled with gloves. Meetings happened in rooms with 2 exits. Captain Dust rearranged guard rotations constantly, so no one outside the inner circle could predict when a corridor would be empty. Lady Miru quietly removed 3 servants from the Queen's household and replaced them with people whose loyalty had been measured in years. And Master Keshen began storing duplicate copies of key decrees in a hidden cabinet behind the archive shelves, because he understood as well as Seren did. The first thing an enemy destroys is the record. Still, none of this answered the deeper problem. Even if Seren survived every physical attack, she was still trapped in a kingdom that fought with names. Her enemies didn't merely want her dead, they wanted her defined. They wanted her name to carry a story that made her impossible. Impossible to obey, impossible to trust, impossible to keep. And the temple, with its nightly chants, was the loudest amplifier of all. One evening, Seren attended the temple recitation from a screened alcove, her presence hidden but deliberate. The 9 lamps burned, incense curled in slow spirals. The priests' voices rose and fell like the river. They spoke Orun's name. They spoke the Founder's name. They spoke the names of past kings, each one offered as proof that the chain had never broken. And then, in a subtle pause, just a fraction of a heartbeat, High Priest Namaru hesitated. It was so small most people wouldn't have noticed. But Seren did. Because a pause in a chant is like a crack in a wall. You might not see it, but you feel the draft. After the recitation, Seren returned to the palace and summoned Master Keshen. not to discuss grain, not to discuss guard rotations, to discuss names. Keshen arrived with a bundle of tablets wrapped in cloth, his face unreadable. Seren didn't sit behind a screen this time. She sat at a table under a single lamp, her hands resting calmly in front of her. "Tell me," she said, "about the last time a ruler's name became a weapon." Keshen's eyes lowered, briefly, as if he were deciding how much truth was safe. Then he placed one of the tablets on the table. It was older than Oren's reign, older than the current council's strongest families. The writing was in an earlier style, the symbols slightly different, the lines less ornate. Keshen spoke quietly. "There was a regent," he said, 2 centuries ago, not a king, not quite a queen, a caretaker of the throne." Seren's gaze remained steady. "What happened?" she asked. Keshen traced the line of text with his finger, not touching it directly, as if respect or caution was still required. "They said his name too often," he replied. "They sang it in the market. They spat it in the alley. They wrote it on walls. They turned it into a joke, then into a curse." Seren leaned in slightly. "And then?" she asked. Keshen's voice dropped even lower. "Then the name became bigger than the man," he said, "and when the name collapsed, it took the throne with it." Seren stared at the tablet. A story as old as politics, and yet sharp enough to cut. A name, overloaded with hatred and rumor, becoming a boulder tied to the kingdom's ankle. She thought of Oren lying in bed, unable to speak clearly. She thought of the council demanding a named regent. She thought of the temple's pause. She thought of the punctured wax seal. And she understood the shape of the danger. Not just assassination, not just rebellion. A war over a word. Seren sat back slowly, her expression calm in the way people look calm when they've just seen the edge of a cliff. "If the name is a door," she said softly, "then it's a door they keep walking through." Keshen watched her, careful, waiting. Seren's eyes lifted to his. "Then I'll close it," she said. Keshen didn't ask how. He didn't need to. In Ilyrra, there were only a few ways to close a door like that. And none of them involved polite conversation. Seren stood, the lamplight catching the edge of her sleeve. "Bring me the oldest records you have," she said, "the ones that describe how names were carved into stone." Keshen's brow tightened, just slightly. Seren continued, her voice still quiet, still controlled. "And send word to the palace stoneworkers," she said, "the ones who repair inscriptions." Captain Dast, near the doorway, shifted his weight, an almost invisible sign of attention. Seren looked past him, toward the corridor, toward the sleeping palace, toward the river beyond. "Tonight," she added, after the second watch. And just like that, the regent behind the curtain stopped merely managing the kingdom's daily breath. She began preparing to change what the kingdom was allowed to say, to change what it was allowed to remember, to take the most dangerous weapon in Ilyrra, a name, and make it disappear. Seren's order was given quietly, which is how the most irreversible decisions are usually made. Not shouted in a hall, not proclaimed from a balcony, just a handful of words spoken under a single lamp to people who understood what those words would cost. Bring the oldest instructions on royal carving. Send for the palace stoneworkers. After the second watch, and once those instructions left her mouth, the palace began to shift around them, subtly, efficiently, like a body preparing for surgery. Because that's what this was going to be. Not an act of passion, an operation. In Ilyrra, names were not written once and forgotten. They were built into the kingdom, carved into lintels over gates, pressed into wax on permits, painted on temple plaques, whispered at the end of prayers like a final stitch that held the world together. So if Seren was going to close the door, as she'd said, she couldn't just stop people from speaking her name. She had to remove the places where the name could be grabbed. And that meant stone. Stone was meant to outlive everyone. Which is why it's almost funny, darkly funny, that stone is also the easiest thing to tamper with if you have enough time and enough permission. A wall can't argue, a monument can't complain, a slab of basalt doesn't call the temple for help, it just sits there and takes whatever you do to it. That night, the palace corridors were quieter than usual, not peaceful, just cautious. Guards stood a little straighter. Servants carried trays with both hands, as if extra care could stop rumors from spreading. And somewhere in Oren's chambers, physicians still whispered over bowls of bitter herbs, trying to convince a fever to respect the monarchy. Serene didn't go to see him, not because she didn't care, because she did. But because she understood something most people learn too late. When power is unstable, public affection becomes a liability. The court wanted to see her grieve, or smile, or panic, or do anything they could interpret. So she gave them nothing. She stayed in the administrative wing, where the air smelled of lamp oil and old paper, and where the walls were thick enough to keep the palace's gossip slightly muffled. Master Keshen arrived with 2 bundles. One was a set of tablets so old the edges had been worn smooth by handling manuals of royal inscription, written in the careful, fussy language of craftsmen who had learned that mistakes on stone were expensive. The other bundle was smaller, wax impressions, seal patterns, border designs, proof of which marks were considered authentic and which would be recognized as counterfeit. Siren studied them the way a river engineer studies the levee before flood season, not with wonder, with calculation. "Show me the standard frame for a royal name," she said. Keshen selected a tablet and pointed to a carved outline, an oval border with stylized reeds along the edge, meant to contain and protect the ruler's name. The border was not merely decorative, it was a signal. This word is sacred. This word is state. This word has consequences. Seren traced the outline with her fingertip without touching the text inside it. "And if you remove the word," she asked, "what remains?" Keshen's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "A void," he said. "And a void," Seren replied softly, "cannot be insulted." Keshen didn't argue. He simply let the silence acknowledge what it needed to acknowledge. This was no longer about aesthetics. It was about survivability. In the hours before second watch, Seren met the stoneworkers in a back courtyard near the storehouses, an area most nobles never entered because it smelled like labor. There were 3 of them. A master carver named Enshu, whose shoulders looked permanently squared from carrying stone, a younger assistant with careful hands, and an apprentice who couldn't hide his curiosity even when he tried. They arrived with wrapped tools, chisels in different widths, mallets of dense wood, scraping blades, sanding stones, quiet instruments if used properly, loud instruments if used in anger. Seren spoke without ceremony. "You know the royal inscriptions," she said. Enshu bowed. "Yes, Majesty." Seren's gaze held him still. "You will remove my name from them." The apprentice's eyes widened just slightly before he remembered his face belonged to him and tried to rearrange it into neutrality. Enshu did not flinch. Stoneworkers, like scribes, survived by not reacting. He asked the practical question, "From which sites?" Seren's answer was immediate. "Public stones first," she said. "Temple courtyard plaques, gate lintels, the river dock monument, the places where the city could point and say the name with confidence, the places where the name could be performed." She paused. "Not everything," she added, "not yet." Because even Seren understood that a kingdom doesn't tolerate abrupt emptiness, not without inventing something worse to fill it. Keshen stepped forward and unwrapped a clay impression. It showed a title line, a formal phrase used in decrees. But the name field was empty. In its place was an epithet, one Seren and Keshen had chosen carefully because it sounded official enough to be accepted and vague enough to be untouchable. "She who remains," not Seren, not Queen Seren, not even Her Majesty Seren. A role, a presence, a fact. And beneath it a small emblem, a crescent over a stylized reed sprig with a single grain-like dot at the base. Simple, repeatable, hard to twist into a marketplace joke. Enshu studied it. "This will be recognized?" he asked. Keshen nodded. "If it is used consistently, it becomes real." That was the scribal truth. Reality in Ilyrra was repetition with a seal. Seren looked at the tools again. "What's the cleanest method?" she asked. Enshu answered like a man reciting from experience rather than theory. "First you chip the surface around the letters," he said. "Then you cut down the strokes. Then you grind the area so the void looks intentional, not damaged." "And if someone tries to read the ghosts of the letters?" Seren asked. Enshu's mouth tightened faintly. "You can't erase completely," he said. "Stone remembers. But you can make remembering difficult." Seren nodded, satisfied in the way someone is satisfied by unpleasant honesty. "Then make it difficult," she said. Second watch arrived. The palace lamps lowered in the corridors. Gates remained guarded, but the rhythm of movement slowed. The city outside slept in pieces. Some houses quiet, some streets still murmuring with late market cleanup, some taverns refusing to admit the day had ended. And in the temple district, the 9 lamps burned through the night like patient eyes. Seren moved with a small group. Captain Dast, 2 guards, Master Keshen, and the stoneworkers. No banners, no announcement, no procession, just people walking through narrow passages that smelled of dust and cool stone. They reached the first site, a plaque mounted in the temple courtyard wall, visible to anyone who entered to pray or petition. It bore the ruler's titles in a neat line, then the name inside the reed oval frame. Enshu unpacked his tools with slow care. The apprentice held a cloth under the working area to catch dust, because even in a ritual crime against permanence, cleanliness mattered. Keshen stood a few paces back, watching the courtyard entrances like a man who understood that a single witness could become a wildfire. Seren watched the plaque. Her name sat there calmly, as if it had never caused anyone pain, as if it had never been used as a handle. And then the first tap of the chisel touched stone, not loud, not dramatic, a soft, dull click. Then another, then a careful series, like someone knocking on a door they don't want to wake. Small stone flakes fell onto the cloth. The first stroke of a letter disappeared, and something in Seren's expression tightened, not grief exactly, more like recognition, because even if she was doing this on purpose, it still felt unnatural, like cutting a thread that had always been there. Enshu worked methodically, reducing curves to roughness, roughness to smooth absence. He didn't smash, he didn't hurry, he unmade. And as the name vanished, stroke by stroke, Seren's mind did what a ruler's mind always does. It ran ahead. If this plaque is changed, what else must change? Temple lists, donor records, festival programs, royal decrees, coin stamps eventually. And if the name disappears from stone, how long before the city notices? How long before the council notices? How long before the high priest pauses again, this time openly? Seren looked at the reed oval frame. They weren't removing the frame, only the letters inside. That was important. A blank frame still told people where the authority belonged. It was a throat without a voice, a crown without a head, but it still demanded your attention. By the time Enshu finished the first plaque, the courtyard was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the stones themselves were listening. The namespace had become a smooth hollow, polished enough to look intentional. Not vandalism, not decay, a decision. Seren exhaled slowly. Next, she said. They moved from site to site. A gate lintel near the granary district. A monument at the river dock where public announcements were posted. A stone column near the palace outer hall. Each time, the ritual repeated. Unpack, position cloth, chisel carefully, grind, smooth, leave the titles intact. And every time, the void grew more familiar, less shocking, more practical, which is a dangerous feeling because once something becomes practical, people stop questioning it. At one point, while Enshu worked on a dock monument, the apprentice glanced at Seren and asked in a voice that tried to be neutral and failed, "Majesty, why?" Captain Dast's hand twitched toward his sword, not because the question was treason, but because questions in the wrong place could become fuel. Seren raised her hand slightly, stopping him. She looked at the apprentice, not with anger, with a kind of tired clarity. "Because they can't poison a blank," she said. The apprentice swallowed. He didn't ask again. By late night, the first phase was complete. The most visible stones had been altered. Not all of them. Seren was not foolish enough to erase everything at once and let the city's imagination run wild. But enough to begin, enough to establish a pattern, enough to make the name feel less inevitable. And with stone changed, the next part began, bureaucracy. Because you can carve a blank into a wall, but if your scribes keep writing your name in ink, the wall becomes theatre. So Seren returned to the scribal hall before dawn, her cloak dusted faintly with stone powder. Keshen was already there, as if he'd never left. He had prepared a set of templates, standard decree openings, standard tax notices, standard dock permits, each with the name field replaced by title and emblem. Not Seren. Not Queen Seren, just She Who Remains, pressed with the crescent reed seal. It looked neat, it looked official. It looked, to anyone who didn't think too hard, like a normal piece of administration. Which is exactly what made it so unsettling. Over the next week, Seren's government began issuing documents in a new language of authority. By order of She Who Remains, let it be recorded under the seal of the throne, under the guardianship of the river mouth, titles and symbols. No name. At first, clerks hesitated, not because they disagreed, but because habits are strong and blank. Spaces feel like mistakes. A junior scribe once asked very carefully, "Should we leave room for the name later?" Keshen answered him without looking up, "No." And that was that. Soon the palace offices were filled with a quiet, tedious confusion. Warehouse managers complained that their ledgers had no proper attribution. Dock officials argued over how to address letters to inland governors. Temple accountants refused to accept a transfer order until it carried a name they could chant in their confirmation prayer. It was, for a bureaucratic kingdom, a nightmare made of paper cuts. No battles, no sieges. Just endless small interruptions. Who signed this? Who authorized that? Under whose name is this tax collected? And Seren's answer, always, was the same. The throne, she said, not a person, a structure, a system, something harder to assassinate. Of course, not everyone accepted it. There was a young scribe in the hall, Talon, an earnest man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of moral certainty that survives only in people who haven't yet been punished for it. He approached Keshen one evening while Seren reviewed petitions nearby. His voice shook slightly, not with fear but with conviction. "This is wrong," he said. Keshen didn't respond immediately. Seren looked up slowly. Talon continued, gaining strength as he spoke. "The temple requires the name," he said. "The gods require the name. A ruler without a name is a shadow." "It's deception." Seren studied him for a long moment. "What do you think a name is?" she asked. Talon blinked, startled by the question rather than the authority behind it. "A truth," he said. Seren nodded once. "And if the truth gets people killed?" she asked. Talon hesitated, just a fraction. In that hesitation, Seren saw the whole problem. People wanted clean answers. They wanted the world to be simple. Name equals truth, truth equals safety. But Ilyrra didn't work that way. Names were used to bless and to curse, to legitimize and to destroy. A name could be a prayer or a noose, depending on who was holding it. Keshen finally spoke, still calm. "You will do as the seal commands," he said. Talon's jaw tightened. "I won't," he said too loudly. The scribal hall went quiet in that particular way. Offices go quiet when someone says the wrong thing. Everyone kept their eyes on their tablets and pretended not to hear, because hearing is a form of participation. Seren stood, not abruptly, just enough to shift the room's gravity. "You're free to refuse," she said softly. Talon looked almost relieved, as if he'd expected punishment and found mercy. Seren continued. "You're also free to leave," she said. "Tonight." His relief faltered. Seren's voice stayed gentle. "Ilyrra is full of places where a man can live honestly," she said. "Far from the temple lists, far from the palace seal. Go." Talon opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to demand a dramatic ending. Captain Dast appeared at his side like a closing door. Not violent, just present. Talon's shoulders slumped. He bowed stiffly, gathered his things, and walked out. He was exiled, officially, removed quietly, like a line scratched from a ledger. Later, there would be rumors, because there are always rumors. Some said he became a temple clerk in a distant town. Some said he tried to speak Seren's name publicly and was arrested. Some said the river swallowed him on a dark road. The palace did not comment. And in Ilyrra, silence was its own verdict. With the dissent handled, the Nameless administration settled into a strange rhythm. People adapted, as they always do. They stopped asking so often. They learned to read the emblem and accept it like a signature. They learned to say, "Her Majesty," and let the sentence end there, as if language itself had been politely shortened. And yet, even as Seren removed her name from stones and documents, she couldn't remove it from memory. Not completely, not yet. She could only make it harder to weaponize. She could only slow the hands reaching for it. For a brief stretch of days, it almost worked. The council complained, but they could not point to a law she'd broken, not easily. The temple grumbled, but it still received its allocations and didn't want to provoke the guard captain. The markets continued, because hunger doesn't wait for legitimacy debates. And Orun remained behind closed doors, neither dead nor fully present, his illness stretching into a long uncertainty. The kingdom balanced on that uncertainty like a cup on a table edge. Then, one morning, as the palace was settling into its new, uneasy normal, the outer gate announced a visitor, a foreign messenger, from the north. The guards brought him through the courtyard with the stiff caution reserved for anyone who could bring either peace or war in a leather satchel. He wore travel-stained clothing and carried a sealed tube, properly bound, properly marked. He bowed to Seren with the kind of practiced respect that diplomats learn early, respect that costs nothing. "I bring a draft treaty," he said, voice steady, "for your review." Keshen accepted the tube and placed it on the table. Seren watched as he broke the seal. The document slid out, clean parchment, crisp ink, the careful formatting of another kingdom's bureaucracy. At the top were titles. At the bottom was a space for a royal signature. And in the opening line, written clearly, confidently, as if it had never been in doubt, was her full name. Not "She Who Remains," not an emblem, not a title, her name, spelled correctly. As if the North had reached across the river, across the temple lamps, across the chisels and the polished blanks, and simply written it back into existence. The parchment lay on the table like it owned the room. Clean, pale, expensive. The kind of document that tells you, without saying it, that someone far away has the time and money to worry about wording. And there it was, right near the top, placed with confident precision. Her name. Not the title, not the emblem, not the careful, bloodless phrase, "She Who Remains." Just the word she'd spend nights chiseling out of stone, spelled correctly too, which was almost rude. Seren didn't react, not outwardly. She simply stared at it for a long moment, letting the silence expand until even the messenger began to look slightly uncomfortable, as if he'd brought a gift that might bite. Master Keshen leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Captain Dast shifted at the doorway, his body language saying what his mouth didn't. One wrong move, and this visitor becomes a problem you solve quietly. Seren's fingers rested on the table edge. "What is this?" she asked, voice level. The messenger blinked once. "A draft treaty," he said. "From the Northern League, for mutual security of trade routes, for stability." Stability. The most popular word in every kingdom right before something breaks. Seren's gaze returned to the ink. The Northern League was not a single nation, not exactly. It was a chain of cold water port cities and river mouths, tied together by contracts and shared paranoia. They didn't conquer with armies. They conquered with tariffs, shipping insurance, and the kind of polite letters that could starve you without ever raising a sword. Their merchants were famous in Ilyrra for three things: their clean scales, their sharp interest rates, and their absolute devotion to documentation. They didn't just want agreements. They wanted proof that an agreement could survive a coup, which, unfortunately, meant they wanted a name, because symbols are easy to copy. Titles change, but a name, so they believed, could be pinned down like a specimen. Seren read the opening line slowly, as if she was simply enjoying the rhythm of legal language. In truth, she was counting the traps. It named her. It named Oren, even in illness, as sovereign. It named the heir as future holder of obligation, which was a polite way of saying, "Your child owes us too." It named trade corridors and dock privileges and patrol responsibilities. It included, in one carefully crafted paragraph, an obligation to allow Northern League inspectors into Ilyrra's salt warehouses upon reasonable notice. Reasonable notice is one of those phrases that sounds friendly until you realize it means, when we feel like it. Seren looked up at the messenger. "Did you write this?" she asked. He shook his head quickly. "No, Majesty. It was prepared by the League's treaty house. I was instructed only to deliver." A rhetorical question, then. "Of course," Seren said softly. "Because the League always did this the same way. They wrote first. They named you first. They defined the world first. Then they waited for you to either accept their version of reality or refuse and be blamed for the consequences." Seren tapped the parchment lightly with one fingertip, right on her name. "This cannot stand," she said. The messenger's expression tightened. He tried, politely, to become firm. "The League requires the name of the ruling authority," he said. "For our ledgers, for enforcement, for recognition." Seren's voice remained calm. "You have the ruling authority," she replied. "You have the seal." "The seal is not sufficient," the messenger said, repeating a line he'd clearly memorized. "And why not?" Seren asked. There it was, one of those simple questions that sounds innocent and behaves like a knife. The messenger hesitated, then gave the honest answer anyway, because honesty is sometimes the most efficient form of arrogance. "Because seals can be stolen," he said. "Titles can be disputed. And, forgive me, a ruler without a name is difficult to hold accountable." Accountable, a beautiful word. A dangerous one, In Ilyrra, people used accountable when they meant punishable. Seren nodded once, as if she were considering an interesting point about weather. And then she did what she always did when someone tried to force her into a corner. She made the corner larger. The League trades with cities, she said, not with individuals. Barges dock, salt changes hands, grain moves, fish rots on schedule. What difference does a name make to a river? The messenger's mouth opened, then closed, because there is no argument that beats bureaucracy's favorite belief that the paper is the world. Master Keshen stepped in gently, voice quiet. The League's requirement, he said, is political, not practical. The messenger's eyes flicked to Keshen, then back to Seren, as if trying to decide which of them was more dangerous. Captain Dast, still at the doorway, decided the answer for him by simply existing. Seren rolled the parchment carefully, as if it were fragile. In a way it was, because that name at the top, her name, was not just ink. It was an invitation. An enemy could point to it, chant it, spit it, nail it to a wall. The League had delivered her a weapon wrapped like a peace offering. Seren handed the rolled draft back. "Tell the League," she said, "that I will not sign a document that turns my name into a public handle." The messenger swallowed. "Majesty, without a name, there is no treaty." Seren's eyes held his. "Then the League does not want peace," she said. "It wants leverage." The messenger bowed stiffly and left with his tube of parchment, escorted by guards who looked calm in the way wolves look calm. When the doors closed, the room breathed again. Keshen spoke first. "They will not accept a blank," he said. Seren's reply was immediate. "They will accept profit," she said, "or they will accept loss. Either way, they will accept something." That was true, but truce could still be expensive, because refusing the Northern League was not like refusing a rude noble at dinner. The League could redirect ships away from Ilyrra's docks. They could raise insurance prices on Illyran barges until merchants stopped sending them. They could quietly discover infestations in Illyran salt shipments and declare them unsafe. They could do all of this while smiling and writing and never once calling it war. And war, the honest kind, was sometimes easier than that. Word of the treaty spread anyway, not officially, of course. Officially, nothing happened until it was announced with proper seals and a temple witness. Unofficially, the palace had servants. Servants had cousins, cousins had neighbors, and neighbors had mouths. By the next market day, people were already whispering that the Northern League had demanded the Queen's name like a tax. By the day after that, the rumor had improved itself, as rumors do. Now it was, the Northern League refuses to recognize her because she's illegitimate. And by the third day, it had matured into something fully grown and dangerous. Now it was, the Queen has no name because she is hiding a crime. The Council of Nobles seized the situation with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for an excuse. Lord Hadrin requested an emergency session. He arrived with a face carved into concern. "The League's demand is reasonable," he said, as if he were discussing the price of barley. "A treaty must be signed by a named authority. This experiment cannot continue." Experiment, another lovely word. It means, I dislike this, and I want to sound rational while I end it. The High Priest's representative, a thin man with clean hands, added his own poison gently. "The temple has also noted," he said, "that the nightly recitations are becoming complicated." Complicated, in temple language, meant, we are losing control of the story. Seren listened without interruption. She watched who spoke, who nodded, who avoided looking at Captain Dast. She watched the council's favorite tactic unfold, pretend their concern is for the people, while aiming it directly at her throat. And then she spoke quietly enough that everyone leaned forward. "What will you give the League?" she asked. Hadrin blinked. "What do you mean?" Seren's tone remained mild. "If I sign with my name," she said, "and the League gains inspectors in our warehouses, patrol rights on our river routes, and influence over our tariffs, what do we gain?" Hadrin began to answer with something about stability and security. Seren cut through it with another simple question. "Security from whom?" she asked. Silence, because the truth was uncomfortable. Security from bandits. The League didn't care about bandits unless bandits interrupted profits. Security from invasion. The League didn't provide armies. It provided support, which meant loans and advisors, security from internal unrest. That was the most honest answer of all, and also the one no one wanted to admit. The treaty was not about borders, it was about controlling Ilyrra while it was vulnerable. Seren looked around the council. "I will not trade the kingdom's river for a signature," she said. Lord Hadrin's mouth tightened. "Then you will trade it for pride," he replied. And there it was, the attempt to make it personal, to pin it to her name. Seren's eyes didn't change. "It isn't pride," she said, "it's containment." The council didn't like that word. It sounded too deliberate, too competent. So they did what councils do when they can't argue the policy. They argued the person. "And yet," Hadrin said smoothly, "this dilemma would not exist if your majesty would simply allow your name to be spoken as it should." As it should. Tradition dressed as inevitability. Seren leaned back slightly. "And if my name becomes the reason the city tears itself apart?" she asked. No one answered, because that question required imagination, and imagination is dangerous in a room full of people who prefer predictable outcomes. After the council session, Seren did not retreat. She did not hide behind the screen. She went to work. Because if she couldn't win the argument about legitimacy, she would win the argument about results. And results, unlike names, could be measured. She ordered a full audit of salt storehouses quietly, without ceremony, not to punish merchants, but to remove the small corruptions that fed the council's allies. She authorized extra grain releases to the poorest districts, enough to keep bellies steady, not enough to drain the stores. She sent river patrols to escort barges along the most dangerous bends, where bandits liked to pretend they were tax collectors. She accelerated levee repairs in the eastern reedlands, where flood damage always turned into resentment. And each act was boring, deliberately boring, because spectacular gestures attracted spectacular resistance. Boring competence, on the other hand, was hard to hate without sounding insane. But the treaty problem remained. The Northern League sent another letter, then another, each one more polite and more sharp. They offered deadlines. They offered assistance. They offered, implicitly, consequences. And always, they returned to the same demand: a name. Seren, Keshen, and a small circle of trusted officials met in a chamber lined with map boards. They talked quietly, like people discussing a disease. "How do we give them what they need?" Keshen asked, "without giving them what they want?" Seren looked at the treaty draft again. "By changing what a signature means," she said. Keshen's eyes narrowed. "The League will say a signature must identify a person," he replied. Seren nodded. "Then we make the treaty identify something they can't assassinate," she said. Captain Dast, who rarely spoke, asked one question. "The throne," he said. Seren's mouth curved faintly. Not quite a smile, more like approval. "Yes," she said. "The throne. In Ilyrra's law, the throne was more than furniture. It was a legal entity, a continuous authority that passed through bodies. Oren could be ill, a regent could change, a council could revolt. But the throne, as a concept, remained, at least on paper, and paper, in Ilyrra, was a kind of religion." Keshen began drafting. Not a plea, not an argument, a structure. The treaty would be rewritten to name the contracting party as the Throne of Ilyrra, under the guardianship of She Who Remains, bearer of the Crescent Reed Seal. No personal name, no birthline, no syllable for the marketplace to chew into a rhyme. Just the throne continuous, faceless, infuriatingly difficult to insult. To strengthen it, Seren ordered something physical. A metal token, stamped with the emblem crescent, reed, grain, dot made from the same alloy used in official dock weights. If the League wanted a unique identifier, she would give them one. A signature you couldn't spell, a signature you couldn't sing, a signature that didn't care what you called it. When the League's envoys arrived, 2 merchants and 1 legal clerk with fingers stained from ink, they were ushered into a reception room that smelled faintly of wax and cool stone. They were polite, they were calm. They were exactly as dangerous as a knife laid gently on a table. They began with compliments. Then they began with demands. Seren listened, nodded, and offered tea that tasted like dried herbs and patience. Then she slid the revised treaty across the table. The clerk read. His eyes moved quickly. His mouth tightened. He tapped the line naming the contracting authority. "This is unusual," he said. Seren's voice was soft. "Ilyrra is unusual," she replied. The envoy tried to laugh, the way people laugh when they want to turn discomfort into charm. "Our ledgers require a name," he said. Seren tilted her head. Why? She asked again, gently. The clerk hesitated, then, as before, offered honesty. Because when a contract breaks, he said, we must know who bears guilt. Seren nodded slowly. And if the contract holds, she asked, do you still need a name? The envoy frowned. That isn't the point. It is, Seren said quietly. She let the silence sit. Then she placed the metal token on the table. The clerk picked it up, turned it, examined the stamping. A unique mark, hard to counterfeit, recognizable. It was, in bureaucratic terms, delicious. The envoys exchanged glances. You could see the calculation, profit now and arguments later. Because that was the League's true art sign first, exploit the interpretation afterward. Finally, the clerk said, we will accept this, provisionally. Provisionally. Another word that means, we intend to revisit this when you're weaker. Seren nodded as if she hadn't noticed. Of course, she said. The treaty was signed, stamped with the crescent reed seal, marked with the metal token's impression in wax. No name, not on the signature line, not in the opening, not anywhere the city could point to and weaponize. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed Seren had done it. She had given the League a contract without giving them her throat. She had outmaneuvered the council's demand for a public name. She had kept the temple from choosing a new chant. And in the palace, that rarest of sensations began to flicker. Breathing room, which is exactly when someone decided to take it away. Because treaties are not merely paper. They are power, condensed. And condensed power attracts hands. That night, the signed document was stored in the palace archive room in a wooden chest with 2 locks, one key held by Master Keshen, the other held by the archive warden, the kind of system people design when they want to feel safe. And perhaps it would have worked if everyone who mattered respected keys. Sometime before dawn, the chest was opened. No splinters, no forced hinges, no obvious violence, just opened. And the treaty was removed with enough care that the locks were returned to their places as if nothing had happened. When Keshen arrived at first lamp to retrieve it for the official announcement, he found the chest empty. For one heartbeat, he simply stood there, staring into the hollow like a man looking into a grave that hadn't been there yesterday. Then he ran. Not panicked, not loud. The controlled run of someone who knows that if you shout, the palace will fill with the wrong people. By the time Seren was informed, the temple bells were already beginning their morning rhythm. Not alarm bells, just the ordinary calls that said the city was waking. Seren walked quickly through corridors that felt suddenly too open. Captain Dast moved ahead, checking corners. Lady Miru appeared like a shadow and whispered that the outer guards had seen nothing unusual, which meant, of course, that something unusual had happened inside. They reached the temple district just as a crowd began to gather. Not a riot, not yet. A curious knot of people, drawn by the scent of public drama, the way insects are drawn to lamplight. And there, nailed to the great wooden door of the temple, right beneath the carved reed oval frames where donor names were displayed, was a sheet of parchment. The treaty, or part of it, pinned where everyone could see. A man stood before it, reading aloud with the theatrical confidence of someone who knows exactly what he's doing. He read the titles first, savoring them. He read the trade terms. He read the obligations. And then, with a deliberate pause, just long enough to let the crowd lean in, he spoke the one thing Seren had spent weeks trying to make untouchable. Her name, clear, loud, in the open air. And as the syllables left his mouth, the crowd reacted the way crowds always react when given a simple target. They murmured. They repeated it. They tasted it. And somewhere behind the temple lamps, behind the incense smoke, behind the carefully maintained illusion of order, the name began to live again. Once the crowd heard her name spoken out loud on the temple door, it didn't stay on the temple door. It moved. It went where names always go in a place like Ilyrra, into alleys, into market stalls, into the pauses between prayers, into the mouths of people who had no idea whether they feared the queen, pitied her, hated her, or simply wanted the comfort of having someone specific to blame before breakfast. And that really was the problem. A title is missed. A symbol is slippery. But a name can be shouted. A name can be painted on a wall. A name can be turned into a song so irritating that by the third day even the fishmongers are humming it without meaning to. Within a week, the city had divided itself into 3 exhausting camps. The temple said the Nameless rule had insulted sacred order. The nobles said it had insulted lawful order. And the ordinary people, who were less interested in philosophy and more interested in bread, said something much simpler. Fine. If there is a ruler, let us know who to blame when the grain price rises. Which, in fairness, is one of the oldest democratic instincts in human history. The trouble began first in the squares, then at the ferry steps, then near the counting houses where merchants kept their ledgers under lock and wax. Arguments broke out over things that would have sounded absurd in calmer times. Was a tax notice valid if it carried only the crescent reed seal? Could a widow claim her dead husband's warehouse if the transfer order named no reigning person? Could a temple donation still buy divine favor if the nightly chant no longer included the ruler's proper name? These are the kinds of questions that sound wonderfully academic until they determine who eats and who doesn't. And in Ilyrra, where paperwork sat only one shelf above religion, the place all of these questions eventually drifted toward was inevitable: the archives. Not the palace audience hall, not the temple steps, not even the council chamber. The archives. Because if you want to know who owns what, who owes what, who inherited what, who promised what, and who lied about all of it later, that is where the kingdom keeps its memory. And Ilyrra kept memory obsessively. The royal archive was not a single room full of neat scrolls and noble silence. That would have been far too elegant. It was a whole little ecosystem of anxiety. Lower rooms lined with clay tallies, some baked hard, some still fragile enough to crack if dropped. Shelves of rolled parchment tied with dyed cord. Wax-sealed tubes holding treaties, tax remissions, border orders, and ceremonial nonsense that no one read unless it became politically useful. Bundles of reed paper copies for daily use. Duplicate ledgers in cedar chests. Seal impressions catalogued in trays. Boundary maps weighted flat with polished stones. And everywhere, dust. Not romantic dust, administrative dust. The kind that settles on a kingdom when thousands of people spend generations trying to prove things to one another. Now, because Ilyrra was humid and not completely foolish, the archive had protections. Stone floors in the inner rooms, water jars placed at intervals, night clocks forbidden from carrying open lamps near the oldest shelves, copies stored in separate chambers. Some of the most important clay records intentionally fired so they would survive damp, rats, and the occasional human betrayal. In theory, this made the archive secure. In practice, it meant only that anyone determined to destroy it had to know exactly where to begin, and someone did. At first, the pressure showed itself as crowds outside the Hall of Registers, the public-facing branch of the archive where people came to verify births, debts, marriages, and property claims. They came angry. A cooper demanding proof that his brother had no legal right to the family yard. A priest demanding restoration of the old royal form in temple copies. A salt broker insisting that northern traders would reject unsigned permits. A cluster of widows who had heard, perhaps correctly, that dead husbands become much easier to manage when the paperwork disappears. And hovering at the edges of all this, as always, were the professional opportunists. The men who carry no banner until they know which way the crowd is turning. The guards held the doors. The clerks kept writing. The people shouted anyway. Then came the first broken window. Not at the palace, at the records house. Because it is one thing to rage at a queen behind stone walls and armed gates. It is another, much easier thing to throw a tile at a building full of documents. The moment mattered because it revealed something ugly and useful. The city no longer believed the fight was about a person alone. It was about proof. Who had it? Who controlled it? Who got to say what counted? Soren understood that immediately. When Captain Darst informed her that a tax crowd had surged against the Hall of Registers, she didn't ask first about the arrests. She asked, which bundles are stored there? That is not the response of a sentimental ruler. It is the response of someone who knows memory has weight. Master Keshen answered without hesitation. Market licenses, debt ledgers, household rolls, district grain tallies, some duplicate copies from the palace archive. Seren stood very still for a moment. Then she asked the question that told Keshen exactly how serious the situation had become. What's that one room, she said, the one we cannot lose? Keshen didn't even pretend to think about genealogy, donor rolls, or royal praise inscriptions. The flood records, he said, the canal gates, the levy surveys, the treasury tallies, the law digests. Seren nodded once. There it was again, the shape of her rule after the name had been turned into a weapon. Not the songs, not the lineage chants, not the polished lies on temple stone, the gates, the grain, the money, the laws. Remove those, and the kingdom becomes a wet argument. For 2 days she tried to calm the city without feeding it a fresh target. Public notices were issued under the Crescent Reed seal, confirming that tax demands would be suspended where records were under review. Temple envoys were told, very politely, that riot was not a sacrament. Additional guards were placed at the public archives, but not enough to make it look like a military occupation. Because that is the strange art of late-stage power. Too little force and you look weak, too much and you create the very rebellion you were hoping to avoid. It almost worked. Almost is doing painful labor in that sentence. The fire began on the 3rd night after the treaty was read aloud. Not in the public hall below, where a mob might be expected to smash and burn in a straightforward, satisfying way. No, that would have made too much sense. It started in the annex behind the Royal Archive, in a storage passage used for duplicate bundles awaiting recataloguing. A narrow place, little traffic, limited access, exactly the sort of location chosen by someone who understood both architecture and consequence. The first clerk to smell the smoke thought it was bad lamp oil. The second thought a cord bundle had caught a spark. By the time anyone opened the passage door, the air had already turned black and hot enough to sting the throat. And then the fire did what archive fires do. It did not roar all at once like a heroic battlefield blaze. It crept, fed, chose, and multiplied. Wax softened first. Seals slumped and broke. The cords around rolled documents shrank and snapped. Dry reed paper curled inward on itself like frightened insects. Parchment blistered, darkened, and split. Wood shelves groaned. Ink bled and vanished into heat. And the clay pieces. This is the cruelly interesting part. Some of the clay pieces survived better than the paper, because fire that destroys one form of memory can accidentally preserve another. History is irritating that way. By the time the bells rang, the archive court was chaos. Bucket lines formed, guards shouted for space. Clerks ran in and out with armfuls of whatever they could grab first, which is how one man saved an entire tray of ceremonial seal patterns and another nearly died for a box of obsolete ferry licenses. Panic is not known for curation. Seren arrived before dawn in a plain cloak, with Captain Dast cutting a path through smoke and confusion. Keshen was already there, ash on his sleeves, his usually careful composure scorched down to urgency. "The inner west room is still reachable," he said, "for the moment." Seren looked at the doorway where heat was pulsing in waves. "Then tell me quickly," she said, "what matters? No poetry, no performance, just triage." Keshen's answer came in a rush. Levy plans, treasury reserve counts, northern treaty copies, law codex bundles, canal rotations, grain district ledgers. Seren gave her orders at once. Save the laws, save the flood records, save the treasury. If the treaty copy is there, take it. Leave the praise rolls. One of the younger archivists stared at her as if she had blasphemed. The royal praise rolls were ancient, expensive, beautifully written, and almost entirely useless unless someone planned to admire them while starving. Seren saw his expression and added with a calmness that probably frightened him more than shouting would have, "The river does not care who was flattered in gold ink." And that was that. They went in. Not Seren herself. She was many things, but not stupid in an operatic way. Keshen and 2 archive men wrapped cloth over their mouths and entered the west room while guards poured water along the corridor tiles. They emerged with scorched bundles, coughing, eyes streaming, carrying the bones of the kingdom in their arms. The law digests came out first, then 2 map cylinders, then the treasury tallies in a cedar case, one side already blackened, then, by blind luck or disciplined memory, a packet containing the League Treaty copy with the Crescent Reed seal intact at the bottom. What did not come out were the dynastic copies. The ancestry bundles, the old ceremonial recitations, the donor sequences, the records that had spent generations telling the kingdom who mattered most. Those burned, some by accident, some because there was no time, and, if you listen to later enemies of Seren, some because she wanted them gone. That accusation never fully died, perhaps because it was useful, perhaps because it was partly true. When the fire was finally contained, Dawn had turned the archive yard into a muddy field of ash, steam, and half-saved evidence. People began arriving before the smoke had even cleared. Nobles wanting answers, temple officials wanting outrage, merchants wanting reassurance, ordinary citizens wanting to know whether their debts had survived. For some of them, this was a nightmare. For others, quietly, it was the best morning they had experienced in years. Imagine every tax notice, every late fee, every disputed grain assessment, every smug little document used against you by a clerk with a good memory, suddenly becoming smoke. For debtors, this was a miracle. For tax collectors, an extinction event. But the kingdom itself could not laugh for long, because once the first relief passed, the deeper horror became obvious. Without records, how do you prove a boundary? Without records, how do you verify inheritance? Without records, how do you know whether a village has already paid or never paid or paid twice because someone with a seal said so? It was the administrative equivalent of waking up to find every account password gone, every backup erased, and the one person who swore they had a system now staring at a pile of charcoal. The council accused Seren before sunset. Naturally, Lord Hadron did it with visible sorrow, which is the most irritating form of accusation. How fortunate, he said, that the very records troubling Her Majesty's position should be the ones most damaged. The temple, not to be outperformed in sanctimony, suggested that divine displeasure had fallen specifically upon a government that refused to speak plainly. And the city listened, because fire always gives rumor fresh lungs. Seren answered with something dangerous, not denial, action. Within a day, she announced a reconstruction order, not of her name, of the state. The new system would use 3 levels of record: working copies on reed paper, district copies on parchment, and permanent state summaries pressed into clay and intentionally fired. Not because clay was elegant, because clay, once baked, did not beg for mercy from humidity. Every major office would now carry its own authenticated seal: treasury, granaries, riverworks, gates, and courts. No single bundle of royal papers would again be allowed to hold the kingdom hostage. No single archive room would again be trusted as the sole memory of law. Copies would be split between 3 sites. The temple would receive only ritual copies, not master originals. District ledgers would be witnessed by office holders rather than by personal royal signature. And perhaps most radical of all, public notices would be organized by function rather than by reign. Canal depth, grain allotment, salt tariff, bridge repair. The kingdom, Seren was saying, would be legible through what it did, not through who sat prettily above it. Was this idealism? Not really. It was survival with filing procedures. Master Keshen oversaw the redesign like a man building a second skeleton while the first one was still smoldering. New rooms were inventoried. Clay workers were commissioned. Surveyors were recalled. Scribes were retrained to reference office seals first and royal authority second. Complaints poured in, of course. The nobles said she was diminishing the crown. The temple said she was mechanizing sacred order. A few old courtmen muttered that soon the kingdom would be ruled by cupboards. And honestly, for a while, it nearly was. But then something inconvenient happened for her critics. The levies held, the grain arrived, the courts resumed, the northern convoy permits were validated, canal schedules were reposted, salt weights were inspected, and ordinary people, those famously difficult lovers of constitutional theory, noticed that life continued, not perfectly, not peacefully, but continued. If you are hungry and the bread still reaches the stall, you become oddly flexible about abstract legitimacy. That did not mean Seren won. It meant she changed the battlefield. By late season, people spoke less often about whether a ruler needed a name, and more often about whether the river toll at East Fork had been corrected, whether the fire compensation lists were fair, whether the new clay summaries could be trusted, which sounds boring. And that is exactly why it mattered. Boring systems are hard to turn into a riot chant. Still, there was a cost. After the fire, Seren withdrew further from view. Not completely. She still issued decisions, still held restricted councils, still appeared through screens or behind curtains when absolutely necessary. But the city began to feel her as a pressure rather than a presence. The seal traveled more than the woman did. The offices spoke more often than the throne. And in a kingdom that had once wanted a name to adore or destroy, Something stranger was emerging. A government you could not quite point at. Months later, when the emergency reconstruction was complete enough for ceremony, the palace announced a formal public confirmation of restored order. Not a coronation, not a morning rite, something more careful, a presentation of continuity. The temple lamps were lit, the court assembled, the rebuilt record summaries were stacked on a side platform like offerings to bureaucracy itself. Merchants, priests, nobles, clerks, and district envoys crowded the hall, all waiting for the same thing. They expected Seren to appear, to stand before them, to reclaim the room physically, if not by name. A curtain had been drawn across the raised platform of rule, where the ceremonial chair sat beneath the reed and crescent emblem. The hall quieted. The curtain was lifted, and there it was, the chair, the emblem, the polished step, everything in its proper place, except the queen. No body, no speech, no attendant announcing illness, no priest explaining a delay, only a narrow stand placed on the seat itself, and on that stand a single sheet, blank. At the bottom, impressed in dark wax, the crescent reed seal. Nothing else, no signature, no farewell, no explanation, just authority and absence. And in that stunned silence, with the whole hall staring at an empty chair and a sealed piece of nothing, Ilyrra understood that the fire had not merely burned paper, it had finished something, or perhaps begun something worse, because now the kingdom had laws, offices, ledgers, and systems strong enough to continue. What it did not have, or no longer seemed to have, was the woman herself. An empty chair is a very loud thing. When a throne is occupied, it is just furniture. But when it is empty, and everyone in the room knows it is supposed to be occupied, that empty space begins to scream. In the great hall of Ilyrra, as the curtain was pulled back to reveal nothing but a polished wooden seat, a small wooden stand, and a single blank sheet of parchment bearing the crescent reed seal, the silence was absolute. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a kingdom realizing that the game it had been playing was suddenly, inexplicably, over. You see, the nobles, the priests, the angry crowds in the market, they had all prepared themselves for a war over a person. They had sharpened their rumors. They had prepared their accusations. They were ready to fight a queen. What they were not prepared to fight was an office, no body, no speech, no dramatic farewell, and definitely no named target for them to aim their frustrations at. She had simply vanished from the physical machinery of the state, leaving only the machinery itself behind. And this is where the story of Ilyrra transitions from a political thriller into something far stranger. Because, historically speaking, when a ruler disappears without a named successor, a kingdom collapses. It splinters. Generals take the armies, nobles take the land, priests take the treasury, and the whole thing burns in a very predictable, very human way. But Ilyrra did not burn. It didn't even fracture. For the first few days, the Council of Nobles waited for the sky to fall. Lord Hadrin and his faction practically vibrated with anticipation, ready to step in and declare martial law the moment the city rioted. But the city didn't riot. Why? Because the next morning, the grain barges still arrived at the docks. The canal gates were opened on schedule. The treasury guards changed shifts. The tax notices were posted on the market boards. Everything functioned. The new clay records, baked hard and stamped with the seals of the various state offices, carried an authority that was maddeningly difficult to argue with. When a salt merchant went to the harbour master to complain about a tariff, the harbour master didn't point to a royal decree. He pointed to a clay tablet stamped with the seal of the river works. There was no queen to blame. There was only the system. It is a terrifying realization for ambitious people to find out that the world does not actually need them to function. The council tried to issue their own orders, attempting to fill the vacuum. But Master Keshen and the scribal hall simply routed their orders through the new bureaucratic maze. A noble's decree had to be verified against the clay summaries, cross-referenced with the treasury seal, and approved by the district clerks. By the time a noble could get an order legally recognized, the season had changed. The kingdom had been wrapped in a cocoon of paperwork so dense, so perfectly layered, that no single sword or ambition could cut through it. And at the center of it all was the ghost of the woman who had built it. The years began to drift past. The river flooded, the river receded. The salt was mined. The barley was harvested. and the absence of the queen became a normal, accepted part of Illyran life. But human beings are storytellers. We cannot tolerate a void for long without trying to fill it with a narrative. Since the state provided no answers, the people invented their own. What actually happened to her? If you sat in an Illyran tavern a decade after the archive fire, you would hear a different answer depending on who was pouring the ale. The most romantic rumor, and therefore the least likely, was that she had slipped out of the palace disguised as a servant, walked down to the eastern reedlands, and lived out her days in a quiet fishing village. They said she traded her silks for rough linen and finally found peace. It is a lovely thought. It is also the kind of thought invented by people who have never actually held power, because power rarely lets you walk away into the sunset. The darkest rumor belonged to the nobles. They whispered that Lord Hadrin and the council had eventually caught her, poisoned her, and buried her beneath the palace foundation. But, the rumor went, they couldn't announce her death because they didn't know how to dismantle the nameless bureaucracy she had created without causing a civil war. So, they were forced to pretend she was still alive, ruling from the shadows, while they secretly cursed her name in the dark. There was another theory, one favored by the temple. The priests quietly suggested that the gods, offended by her refusal to be named in the chants, had simply erased her from the physical world. A divine punishment for administrative arrogance. But the most interesting theory, the one that makes modern historians sit up and pay attention, came from the scribes themselves. Decades later, a quiet subculture of clerks began to whisper that the queen had never really existed at all. Or rather, that the woman named Seren had died alongside King Oran years ago, and that the entire Nameless Queen era was an elaborate fiction invented by Master Keshen. They claimed the chief scribe had used her identity as a shield to build a government ruled entirely by the archives. Think about that for a moment. A kingdom that functioned so smoothly without a face that people began to wonder if the face had ever been real. We will likely never know the absolute truth of her physical fate. There is no tomb. There is no final medical ledger. There is no official record of her death. But in a way, her physical fate is the least important part of her story, because we are left with the view from the future, the view of the historian sifting through the dust. When you study history, you are taught to look for the loud things, the golden masks, the massive pyramids, the statues of men riding horses, the epic poems about kings who killed thousands of people to ensure their names would never be forgotten. We are taught that history is a ledger of egos. But how do you read a blank space? How do you study an absence? When archaeologists and historians first began excavating the ruins of Ilyrra centuries later, they were deeply confused. They found a complex, highly advanced river society. They found evidence of massive trade, sophisticated water engineering, and a legal code that was centuries ahead of its neighbors. And everywhere they looked, they found the frames, the beautiful carved reed ovals on the temple walls, the ceremonial indentations on the public monuments, the spaces at the bottom of heavy clay treaties, all of them perfectly, deliberately empty. At first, early scholars assumed Ilyrra had been conquered by a particularly thorough enemy who wiped out the local dynasty. But as they dug deeper, the evidence didn't match. Conquering armies smash things. They replace old names with new names. They don't carefully grind down a single word while leaving the titles of state perfectly intact. It took decades of translating the clay summaries, of piecing together the fragmented reed paper salvaged from the ash layer of the Great Fire, to understand what had actually happened. They weren't looking at the destruction of a legacy. They were looking at the legacy itself. The absence of the name was the evidence. It requires a profound shift in how we think about human ambition to understand what she did. Next time you scroll through a screen, or sign a contract, or look at how hard people fight to be noticed, to be verified, to be known, think about this woman. We live in a world that is obsessed with being visible. We believe that if we are seen, we are real. We believe that if our name is spoken, we matter. She lived in a world that believed the exact same thing. The nightly chants, the wax seals, the stone carvings. Ilyrra was a machine designed to worship visibility. And she looked at that machine, saw that it was going to crush her, and simply stepped out of the light. She realized that immortality is a trap, that when you carve your name in stone, you are not making yourself a god. You are giving your enemies a target that cannot move. You are giving the future a handle to grab you by. If your name is on the wall, people can throw mud at it. If your name is on the law, people can rebel against it. If your name is on the throne, people can kill you for it. But if you are no one, if you are just a seal, a title, a shadow behind a curtain, a set of instructions written in cold ink, you become invincible. She didn't erase herself out of modesty. She didn't do it out of shame. She did it out of an almost terrifying level of political genius. She traded her personal immortality for the survival of the state. She let her ego die so the kingdom could live. And the ultimate irony, the beautifully dark joke of the whole thing, is that by trying so hard to be forgotten, she became the most fascinating mystery her kingdom ever produced. We don't know the names of the council lords who tried to overthrow her. They are lost to time. We don't know the names of the northern merchants who tried to extort her. We barely even remember King Orun, the man whose illness started the whole crisis. But we remember the blank space. We remember the nameless queen. The void she carved out of history proved to be more durable than any monument she could have built. Which brings us, finally, to the end of the river. Far south of the old capital, past the ruined docks, past the places where the great salt barges used to turn, the river delta flattens out. The water slows down, spreading into a wide, quiet marsh where the reeds grow tall and the air always smells faintly of brine. It is an empty place. The kind of place you only go if you have absolutely no desire to be found. Decades ago, a local farmer was digging a new irrigation trench in this marsh. His shovel hit something hard beneath the mud, not a natural rock, something cut. He dug it out, washed away the dark, heavy silt, and found a small, rectangular block of basalt. It was not a grand piece of stone. It wasn't polished marble. It was just a marker, the kind used to signify property lines or local graves. There were no titles on it, no long, boastful lines about divine right or guardian spirits. At the top, lightly etched into the dark stone, was a single symbol, a crescent moon, a sprig of reed, and a single dot of grain, the seal of she who remains. It is the only physical artifact ever found outside the capital that bears her specific, personal mark. But it is what was written beneath the symbol that makes historians stare at it in quiet awe. It was carved in the old Illyran script, not the formal, rigid lettering used by the palace stoneworkers. It was written in the flowing, slightly slanted hand of a scribe, or, perhaps, the hand of someone who had spent her youth watching scribes, learning that ink was a weapon, and who eventually decided to put the weapon down. It is just one sentence. It doesn't ask to be remembered. It doesn't ask for forgiveness. It is not a prayer to the gods, and it is not a warning to future kings. It is simply a statement of fact. A quiet, exhausted truth from a woman who had fought a war against her own identity and won. The inscription reads, "The name was the trap." And maybe, in the end, she was right. We spend our waking hours making sure our names are spelled correctly on screens, on accounts, on endless digital ledgers. We fight to be noticed, to be recorded, to be remembered. But tonight, none of that matters. If this strange, quiet journey into the blank spaces of history helped you unwind, you can leave a like and subscribe. But do it only if you genuinely enjoy these slow, shadowy documentaries and want to keep wandering through the forgotten corners of the past with me. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what lost empire, doomed royal, or quiet historical mystery would you like to drift into next? But that is a decision for tomorrow. For now, there is absolutely nothing else you need to do. You don't need to type, or click, or worry about leaving a record. You don't need to be visible to anyone. No ledgers to balance, no titles to defend. Just let your screen go dark. Let the fan keep humming its soft, steady rhythm in the background. And let the nameless queen stay exactly where she always wanted to be, hidden safely in the quiet dark. Good night.